Okay, so I want to welcome you all to our Zoom briefing today. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We are a 38-year-old free market think tank based in Dallas. Um, Related to today's topic, we were started during the Reagan administration. I'd like to welcome you all to this policy briefing with Dr. William Inboden on Reagan, the Peacemaker. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate you being here. I especially want to thank those of you who are supporters of IPI's work, donors. We very much appreciate it. And if after this discussion you want to know more about IPI or you'd like to become a supporter, I would invite you to contact Addie Clements at IPI, and she'll be delighted to talk with you about how you can get more involved with IPI. Um, she is on the Zoom right now, so you can even private chat with her through Zoom if you want to. But the Addie is the place to go if you want to find out more about IPI or how you might be able to get involved. We're going to try to take as many audience questions as possible today. Again, we want you to use the Q&A function down below on the bottom menu if you want to do that. If you post questions in the chat or if you raise your hands, we may or may not get to you. And again, this event is being recorded and made available at our website and on our YouTube channel. Okay, housekeeping out of the way. Age can be a blessing and a curse, but I consider it a blessing that I'm old enough to have clear recollection of the Reagan years. I was a freshman in college when Ronald Reagan ran for the first time in 1979 for president, 1980. And I even got to meet him twice in person. For me, at least, and if you ever visit IPI's offices, you'll see not one but several pictures of Ronald Reagan hanging in our offices. For me, at least, Ronald Reagan is still the lodestone of practical conservative governance. Certainly not perfect, but the best we've done in my lifetime. So any excuse for me to talk about Ronald Reagan is a treat. And anytime I hear anybody saying we need to move on from Reaganism, anytime I hear anybody talk about zombie Reaganism or whatever, them's fighting words for me. So I'm really delighted to have this chance to revisit the Reagan years and specifically his foreign policy success and how we might apply some of those observation and principles to the many foreign policy challenges that we have today. And the perfect person to do that with is Dr. William Inboden, who has a relatively new book called Reagan, the Peacemaker. It's wonderful. I've read part of it. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I've read part of it. And I know many of you will go out and grab copies of it. There you go, right there. Look at that. Very good. Very good. It's a great read, and I hope that a lot of you will go out and get it. I'll give a brief bio. Dr. William Inboden is professor and director of the Alexander Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. And he was recruited away from the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin by his friend, Ben Sasse. So it was a loss for UT Austin, but a tremendous gain for the University of Florida. And Dr. Inboden, I'm going to start our conversation in a moment, but first I want to ask, tell us how you know Senator Sasse.
Oh, we first met 30 years ago. We both, when we were undergraduates, we both did a study abroad our junior years of college at Oxford University and connected there. And then we went to graduate school together, and then we worked in the George W. Bush administration together. And his years as a senator, I helped him out on foreign policy on the side. So yeah, we've been friends for a long time.
I didn't know anything about Ben Sasse until he was elected to the Senate. And the first noteworthy thing was that he respected the old traditional Senate tradition of not giving a speech until he'd been in the Senate for a year. And that told me something about him. In fact, that told me a lot about him. That he was there to roll up his sleeves and do the work, not just to use the Senate as a platform to build his own brand. And that was the first of many things that impressed me about Senator Sasse. Okay, so let's get started. And I want to start by just asking you, I think that the title of your book is sort of an intentional irony, because again, I can remember the Reagan years, and I can remember how his opponents decried him as a dangerous and unhinged warmonger. You know, he was going to get us into nuclear war. He wanted to initiate conflict with the Soviet Union. There were even people who talked about him having weird evangelical apocalyptic beliefs. that he intentionally wanted to start a nuclear war, to usher in the end times and all that kind of crazy stuff. But yet you title your book Reagan the Peacemaker, because the reality of Reagan's foreign policy was much different than his critics suggested would be the case. So was the title intentionally ironic?
Yeah, well, no, thanks for picking up on that, Tom. And I mean the title in all sincerity, in terms of I do think that Reagan's desire was obviously a peaceful victory in the Cold War, and we can talk a little bit more about what that meant. But I also knew that picking that title would be provocative, especially for Reagan's critics, who, just as you said, then as now wanted to dismiss him as this, cowboy warmonger, or this, unhinged, unstable aggressor, which just wasn't the case. The title came to me about halfway through the process of researching and writing the book. So I didn't start with the title and then go write the book. I was working on the book and I wasn't sure what the title was going to be. And then over and over through the course of the research, I kept on seeing Reagan refer to himself as wanting to be a peacemaker, and realized this is a very sincere desire on his part. And then I came across a number of instances of his Soviet rival turned partner, Mikhail Gorbachev, calling Reagan a peacemaker, including a very moving testimonial. The way I closed the book at Reagan's funeral, when Reagan's casket was lying in the state of the Capitol, when Gorbachev called him a great peacemaker. So I thought, well, if Gorbachev can call him a peacemaker, then that's good enough for my book title as well.
So it's interesting because again, I pointed out that I have very clear recollections of the Reagan years. There were a lot of conservatives who thought Reagan was being taken in by Gorbachev. I mean, we were in such a, and I'll stop with this and sort of let you go for a while. But there were a lot of conservatives who really thought that Reagan in his age and in his naivete was being taken in by Gorbachev, especially when Reagan said things about phasing out all nuclear weapons and things like that. I mean, we had such a habitual distrust of Soviet propaganda and of Soviet leaders. And I can remember articles in National Review criticizing Reagan for his engagement, and he turned out to be right, and many of his critics, even on the right, turned out to be wrong about that.
Mm. Yeah, and that's a theme that pops up in the book quite a bit, especially in the second half when Gorbachev comes on the scene. And Reagan was very, as a committed conservative himself, he was very mindful of these conservative critiques he was getting from the right wing. But as I'll share in a little bit, I think he had good reason to have been willing to take a chance and trust Gorbachev earlier than most people thought, and that was obviously vindicated. But yeah, he took a lot of heat from his right wing supporters there. But interestingly, it wasn't just his conservative supporters. There's a really interesting interview done of him in the Oval Office in December of 1987. So this is, Gorbachev's been in power almost 3 years at this point, by all the network anchors. So it's Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings and Dan Rather. None of them are conservatives, right? And the three of them are really pressing Reagan, basically saying, aren't you getting fleeced and snookered by this wily Soviet leader Gorbachev? Isn't he looking to take advantage of the United States? Don't you worry that you're weakening our country? And Reagan, is very articulate and principled and explaining to them why he thinks they're wrong on that. But it was a reminder that the heat and criticism he got came from all sides. But visionary and strategic leadership sometimes entails taking some of those chances, but also seen things that other people can't see. And he had seen a real commitment on Gorbachev's part to reducing nuclear weapons and dialing down the Cold War tensions. Ultimately, it bears repeating, though, that Reagan and Gorbachev did not desire the same thing. Yeah, they wanted peace, but Gorbachev wanted peace while preserving the Soviet Union, and Reagan wanted peace while seeing the Soviet Union dissolved and going extinct. And that's where they parted ways. And of course, Reagan. Yeah.
Of course, of course. Why don't you give us sort of an overview of your book and of the main points and sort of the what you think are the most important sort of observations and conclusions from the book, and then I'll ask you how you think some of those might be applied to some of the challenges that we're seeing today.
Sure, yeah, lot we could say there. So I'll try to do some of the highlights here, just for 15 minutes or so, so we allow plenty of time for Q&A. But the first thing I want to tell all of our viewers is I wrote the book as a narrative, right? So it unfolds as a story, and I hope if you do get a chance to pick it up, you'll find it a readable story. But I want to highlight this because there's a couple of arguments embedded in doing it as a narrative. There's some particular reasons why I wrote that way. The first one is, with each passing year that we're further and further removed from the peaceful end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union and avoiding nuclear war, I think there's been a growing sense among the younger generation, but even among some of the older generation, that, oh, it was all just inevitable. Like, there's no way the Soviet Union could have continued existing. There's no way the world would have been blown up in a nuclear war. All those worries were just overblown, and Reagan just kind of got lucky. He happened to come along at the right time when all these inevitable events were playing out, and he was lucky to just be on the stage when this was happening. And so one reason why I wrote the book as a chronological narrative, so it unfolds, through the 8 years of his presidency, day by day, month by month, is I wanted to recapture for readers what the world looked and felt like at the time. Because, Tom, you mentioned you're old enough to remember the Reagan years in the Cold War. It was terrifying, right? We didn't know at the time that it was going to end peacefully and that we wouldn't get destroyed in a nuclear war. And even though Reagan had his very clear strategic convictions, when he went into the Oval Office every day, he didn't know if it'd be his last day on Earth. But he did know that whether or not it was his last day on Earth would depend in part on decisions he was making, right? So the pressure of that is just overwhelming. But writing it as a narrative that unfolds in real time also, I hope, recaptures for readers some of the really momentous and consequential choices that Reagan made. As we were talking about earlier, whether it was choice to embrace Gorbachev as a partner for peace, or some of the other choices he made to be much more confrontational and assertive towards the Soviet Union. Other presidents wouldn't have done it that way. And so I'm trying to show readers that leadership matters, that history is not inevitable, that a strong and visionary and principled and courageous leader can make decisive decisions at real crossroads that can move history in one direction or another, that can shape how events play out. And so I hope that readers can see again that the peaceful end of the Cold War was not this inevitable result of impersonal forces, but was the result primarily of courageous decisions made by Ronald Reagan, especially, as well as Gorbachev. But the other reason why is, even though the Cold War is the main theme of the book, and that's what I'll focus my remarks on today, if you do have a chance to read the book, you'll see it's also about all the other foreign policy issues that Reagan was dealing with. Counterterrorism, hostage crises, trade tensions with Asia, democracy movements in Asia and Latin America, famine in Ethiopia. All the other national security challenges that cascade in on a president's desk every day. And what I do in writing the book as a narrative is show how every decision Reagan is making about the Cold War are in this context of these 20 or 30 other or 40 other issues crashing into his inbox. This is where I was able to draw on my own time from working on the National Security Council for President Bush and seeing, up close, everything that a president has to deal with. And so it's another way of humanizing the story and showing all the other challenges that Reagan was facing while he's crafting this visionary Cold War strategy. Okay, so to turn to the Cold War strategy itself. It's also important to recapture just how difficult a hand Reagan inherited when he was elected in 1980, and then when he raises his right hand to take the oath of office on January 20th, 1981. If you would have done a scorecard tally sheet in the Cold War at that time, just about everyone would say the Soviet Union is winning and the United States is losing, right? So our military was weakened and demoralized from the loss just a few years earlier in the Vietnam War. And then, a decade of being underfunded and budget cuts from the Democratic Congress. Of course, you had the Iran hostage crisis going on, which was further humiliated America, made us appear very, very weak to the world. You had we were in a multi-year economic recession with that awful phenomenon of stagflation, high inflation and high unemployment that had bedeviled Gerald Ford and then Jimmy Carter. You had the energy crisis, right, still in the aftermath of the OPEC oil embargo. Um, and then you just had an American people who were divided and demoralized among themselves. We didn't believe in ourselves as a country anymore. We were still divided over the Vietnam legacy. We had lost faith in our free market system because of the several years of economic malaise. And looking around the world, not only was the Soviet Union militarily stronger than us, but Soviet communism was advancing across the third world. So South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, South Yemen, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, a few other countries I could mention, had all fallen to communism in the previous decade. Again, going back to the Cold War tally sheet, it's not just that the Soviets seem militarily stronger than the United States, it's that communism seemed to be the wave of the future, with all these other countries going communist. Now,
And
they weren't.
I don't
Oh,
want to
good.
interject. I want to interject
Yeah.
just to underscore your point. Again,
Yeah.
as a senior in high school, for me, it was all encapsulated by the failed rescue attempt
Yeah.
uh, of the Iranian
Desert
hostages.
One. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
here you have, we can't even pull off a military exercise. I mean, my recollection, I was 50 years ago or whatever, was that basically we had our helicopters crash in the desert and we couldn't even pull off a rescue mission. We couldn't even get there. And again, I think for a lot of people that encapsulated the feeling you're describing is we are failing as a nation, economically, militarily, all of that stuff.
Yeah. No, exactly. And so, yeah, so Reagan takes office at a very hard time. And here's where there's one more really important point to appreciate about the very new approach he brought to the Cold War. Going back to Harry Truman, who's our first Cold War president, every president from Harry Truman on forward to Jimmy Carter, Democrats and Republicans, they'd had their policy differences here and there, but they'd all had more or less the same strategic framework for the Cold War, which is the assumption that the Soviet Union is a strong and durable nation state. It's been around for decades. It will be around for another century. It's not our friend. Right? They knew it's not our friend. But they thought the best that we can do is contain it. We just need to manage this competition with the Soviets. We don't want to let them get too much stronger and expand too much more. But they just saw it as a great power competition that happened to have some ideological differences, right? That happened to be a battle of ideas as well. And Reagan rejects that. And instead, he reverses it. He doesn't believe that the Soviet Union is strong and stable and durable. He believes that they are weak and vulnerable. Now, they're militarily dangerous, but he thought that their economy was a mess, the political system had no legitimacy, and that with enough pressure, it could be brought down. It could be collapsed. And the reason he came to that insight is he saw this, he had a very different theory of the case in the Cold War. He saw the Cold War as primarily a battle of ideas between democratic capitalism and Soviet communism and tyranny. And so it's primarily a battle of ideas. And he saw Soviet communism as idea to be defeated. So that's why, during the campaign, he had famously said, my theory of the case in the Cold War is pretty simple. We win, they lose. And that's classic Reagan, right? It's pithy, it's punchy, but there's actually much more strategic brilliance, I think, to those four words than was appreciated at the time, because no other president had actually thought we could win in the Cold War. It was just something to manage. And similarly, no other president had thought that the Soviet Union could actually lose the Cold War, but rather, again, it was just a competition for us to manage. And so, Reagan brings an entirely new strategic framework to the Cold War and the contest with the Soviet Union, which is, I think, remarkable in any context, but especially at that time when he comes into office with the United States in pretty bad shape, and the Soviets seeming to be ascendant. Turning now I'll just give a few highlights of what his Cold War strategy actually entailed, some of the features of it, and then we'll turn, of course, to the discussion time. Um, While Reagan very much believed that Soviet communism could be defeated, and that was his goal, I'm convinced. I think the record is very clear on that. He also wanted to keep the Cold War cold. This is very important, going back to our discussion about him as a peacemaker. He was terrified of nuclear weapons, as any sane person would be. He did not want the Cold War to turn hot. He also had taken on board some of the lessons of Vietnam about being very cautious about even deploying conventional force and deploying, American, ground troops in a large-scale combat operation. And so he has these two different priorities of winning the Cold War and defeating the Soviet Union while also keeping it peaceful, achieving a peaceful victory. And so my argument for how he brought all that together, kind of what's his real end goal in the Cold War, is to bring the Soviet Union to a negotiated surrender. Okay, so negotiated, of course, because he's committed to diplomacy, and we'll talk about that. But surrender because he wants it defeated. So a negotiated surrender. So that's kind of my summary of what his end goal is, his priority for the Cold War. How's he going to go about that? Well, he does it through two prongs of pressure and outreach. There's some scholars out there who've argued that Reagan reversed himself. That in the first term, he is more of a hardliner, and then he becomes a softie when Gorbachev comes along. I don't think that's the case. I think it's pretty clear that for all 8 years, he kept up his pressure on the Soviet Union. We were talking earlier about, the question about if he was too trusting of Gorbachev. And one reason I don't think he was too trusting is he was also keeping the pressure on Gorbachev. But all 8 years, Reagan was very consistent in his outreach to Soviet leaders, saying, "Hey, let's sit down, let's negotiate, right? Let's see if we can bring this conflict to a peaceful end. It's a peaceful end on terms favorable to the United States." And so I think it's important to keep in mind that he had both of those prongs together, and there was a strategic vision behind it. He wanted to negotiate with the Soviets, but only from a position of strength, which is why he was so focused on restoring America's economic and military strength. To highlight just a few of those prongs of pressure, the first one, of course, is the military pressure. Reagan presides over a substantial increase in the defense budget. And he gets strong bipartisan support for that from Congress. He had a line. He said the Soviets liked the arms race a lot better when they were the only ones running it, right? So he believed we can, with our free enterprise system and restoring our economic strength, we can compete with the Soviets in an arms race. But there's a very important thing to appreciate about his military buildup and modernization, which I highlight in my book, and very few other books on Reagan I think had picked up. He didn't just want to outbuild and outspend the Soviets militarily. He wanted to outsmart them. And he was remember, he'd been governor of California for 2 terms before becoming president. And so he had presided over the first big technology boom in Silicon Valley in the 60s and 70s. He's a great believer in American private sector innovation and our technological edge and our entrepreneurship. And he wanted to harness that to design a new generation of weapon systems that were so much more technologically advanced than anything the Soviets could bring to bear, that no matter how many more rubles the Soviets threw at their forces to try to keep up spending-wise numerically, that our qualitative edge of our more superior and advanced weapon systems would outmatch the Soviets across any dimension of force projection. And we can talk about some of the details on that in the Q&A if you would like. That, of course, pivots to the economic pressure. He believed that the Soviet economy was vulnerable and weak and fragile. In hindsight, we know that he was absolutely right about this, but very few experts saw this at the time, whether economists or Sovietologists or CIA analysts or analysts in other countries. Most people believe the Soviet economy may not be the most dynamic one in the world, but it'll keep growing at 1 to 2, maybe even 3% a year. It'll just kind of keep bumping along. Reagan thought it was a house of cards. He one of the things that was very telling for him is that despite the millions of acres of farmland in the Soviet Union, their system was so inefficient they couldn't feed their own people, which is why they kept on needing to buy grain from American farmers. And so Reagan believed if we put economic pressure on this system, given how much they're trying to spend on their military, that they just won't be able to keep pace. And he had a number of other prongs of his economic strategy of cutting off high-tech exports to the Soviet Union and below market loan credits and things like that. He had the ideological dimension of his pressure. He was, more than any other American president, he told the truth about Soviet communism. And even people who don't know many other things about Reagan will remember some of his really memorable turns of phrase. And I'll mention those in a moment, but I want to say if you read all of his foreign policy speeches in sequence, as I did over the years of researching this book, you'll see that behind each of those memorable phrases, there was a much more sophisticated strategy of making a strong critique of the moral bankruptcy of Soviet communism and praising the virtues of free societies, of free markets, of free political systems, of religious freedom. So in 1981 at Notre Dame, he says that the West won't just contain communism; it will transcend communism and dismiss it as some, bizarre chapter in history whose last pages are even now being written. So he predicted the demise of it about 10 years before it happened. In 1982 at Westminster, with Margaret Thatcher sitting in front of him, he says that Marxism, Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history. In 1983, he calls it an evil empire, right? In 1987, he stands at the Berlin Wall and says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And again, those are all wonderfully eloquent and memorable turns of phrase, but each of them was backed up by a pretty long, detailed, sophisticated speech laying out all the problems with Soviet communism. And this, of course, drove the Kremlin nuts. But it also was very encouraging to dissidents and other critics of and victims of Soviet communism behind the Iron Curtain or inside the Soviet Union itself. And I tell a number of those stories from in my book about how when Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, it was very encouraging to a number of imprisoned dissidents in the Gulag, imprisoned for their Christian or their Jewish faith or for criticizing the Soviet regime. And so in that way, he came to be seen as a great champion. For the peoples of the Soviet Union, not their leaders, of course, but many of the people came to see him as the one who's giving voice to their fears, their concerns, their own criticisms of their government. Which relates to another part of his strategy was supporting human rights and religious freedom. Right, he was, in addition to his eloquent speeches, he pressed the Soviets a lot to release Jewish refuseniks, to release Christian pastors, to release political dissidents. Partly out of his humanitarian concern, but he knew that any political system that has to imprison its own peaceful dissidents or critics is weak and vulnerable, right? It doesn't have the trust and the legitimacy of its own people. If it's so afraid of its own people like that, that this is another wedge that he can push and exploit. And finally, I should mention another important prong of his pressure was allies. He knew that the Soviet Union didn't have any real true friends. Right? Sure, it had the Warsaw Pact, of Poland and East Germany and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and other countries behind the Iron Curtain, but they were involuntary colonies, really. They were vassal states. They were occupied by the Soviet army. They were not true allies, whereas Reagan knew that our allies had voluntarily chosen to join NATO, or in the case of Japan and South Korea and Australia, to join our alliance in Asia and in the Pacific. And so Reagan saw this as a great source of American strength, that we have all these other countries who share many of our values, who are committed to military and intelligence cooperation with us. And so he was deeply committed to the allies, just as the Kremlin was really freaked out by our allies and did everything it could to weaken our alliances. And so Reagan saw, all right, if the Kremlin is trying to weaken our alliances, that tells me they're afraid of them. The final point I'll say, so those are all the prongs of pressure, is his outreach efforts as well. Reagan's pressure was connected very directly to his diplomacy. It wasn't just that he wanted to negotiate from a position of strength. One more finding of my research and an argument I make in my book is that part of Reagan's pressure strategy on the Soviet Union was to, and get this, this is very important, pressure the Soviet system to produce a reformist leader that he could negotiate with. And he spells that out in some internal national security documents that were recently declassified that I cite in my book in 1981 and 82. And so all along, as he's pressuring the Soviet system, he's trying to pressure it to support a reformer to come to power. It wasn't the case with Brezhnev, who dies. Wasn't the case with Andropov, who dies. Wasn't the case with Chernenko, who dies. Finally, 4 years after Reagan's president, Mikhail Gorbachev comes along. And that's partly why Reagan recognized Gorbachev as a reformer sooner than most, because if you're looking for something, you're a little more apt to find it. And because his strategy had been predicated on let's pressure the system so much it becomes so weak and so fragile and in such a crisis that its leaders, have to turn to a more reformist leader, and then I'll have a negotiating partner. And then from there, of course, he and Gorbachev do build a meaningful partnership. They signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. He gets the Soviet Union to agree to allow freedom to the in autonomy to the countries of Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain, and to withdraw from Afghanistan. And of course, a couple years after Reagan leaves office, the Soviet Union itself dissolves. So a lot more I could say, but the most interesting time, of course, will be our Q&A. So I thought I'd toss those highlights out to you, and happy to take it wherever any of you would like to go.
No, that's terrific. I very much appreciate it. I love the fact that you some of Reagan's best known lines were very simple, but there was a lot of thought and preparation behind it because one of the unfortunate critiques of Reagan was that he was a simpleton, right?
Hmm.
Because he would say things in very simple terms, we win, they lose, that kind of
Yeah,
thing. And
yeah.
so he was criticized as a simpleton, but I remember when his notes came out from some of his radio addresses,
Mhm.
where his handwritten notes, where it was really clear that he was a deeply thoughtful and philosophical man. But he had the ability, maybe because of his, acting career or whatever, he had the ability to take, you know, both economic and foreign policy and philosophical principles and just distill them down and say them in very accessible ways that people could get to. He
Yeah.
was far from a simpleton.
Yeah, and then Tom, let me just give you two brief examples of exactly this, going back to those speeches. The first is when he said that Marxism, Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history in his wonderfully eloquent 1982 Westminster Address in London. Uh, the reason that that was so profound is he was taking Marxist ideology and turning it on its head, because Marxist ideology believes that there is an inevitable dialectic in history pointing towards the eventual demise of capitalism, and bringing in the workers' paradise. So this belief in historical determinism is central to Marxist ideology. So Reagan takes that and says, no, it's not us capitalists who are going to end up on the ash heap of history. It's the Marxists who will. And one other one, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. That caused all sorts of tut-tutting and fretting at the New York Times and the elite liberal media. How dare Reagan call them evil, right? Well, they were evil. It also drove the Kremlin crazy. Kremlin was not so bothered about being called evil. They didn't like being called an empire because,
Uh,
again, Marxist ideology says it's the capitalists or the imperialists, right? They're always wanting to grab imperial properties for more capitalist exploitation of poor people's resources and so on. And so the Soviets were always denouncing the quote imperialist West and saying that they're anti-imperialists. And so for Reagan to say, no, you guys are an empire. Look at how you are occupying Afghanistan, or how you're occupying Poland, or any of the other Iron Curtain countries. So that's what I mean about some of these most memorable, pithy, pointed phrases of his. Yeah, they're powerful, but they also have a lot more profundity and depth to them because he understood the Cold War as a battle of ideas.
my my heroism related to Ronald Reagan, I think, is based on a couple things. First of all, he had what I always refer to as moral clarity.
Mm-hmm.
He really did believe in good and evil. He really did believe that freedom is morally superior to subjugation, that democracy is morally superior to tyranny. He really did believe that religious freedom is morally superior to religious, subjugation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we just don't get that very often in many of our leaders. The other thing about it was that because of his moral clarity, he had a confidence, and you've described this. He had a confidence that Marxism is not going to work. It doesn't work, and it's not going to work. It's not going to stand the test of time. He had a confidence in America. He had a confidence in the American people. And again, not to rehash this point, but that was dismissed by the elites and the intelligentsia as being overly simplistic, you
Mm-hmm.
know. But it's something that it's something that we really miss. I really miss in our leadership. I don't like presidents who see moral equivalency everywhere that they look, whether it's foreign policy or whatever. You don't. if you don't have a goal, you never achieve it, you know. And Reagan had goals that were based on his moral clarity and on his confidence in capitalism and American democracy.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And just to kind of put a particular point on that, a lot of his moral clarity it came from his Christian faith. And this was another thing I was surprised to find in my research is how his faith was much deeper, more sincerely held, and much more influential in shaping his foreign policy and his presidency than I'd appreciated. And so that's one of the things that gave him the strength to ignore all the criticism and the disparaging and the doubters. And an especially poignant moment, and I talk about this in the book, is just 2 months into his presidency, he almost dies in the assassination attempt, right, from John Hinckley Jr. And while he's recovering, Reagan writes these very moving entries in his diary, and he had prayed that God would spare his life. He came very close to death. If the bullet had been just another millimeter to one side, it would have severed his carotid artery, and thank God didn't. But Reagan says, I think God has spared my life for a reason, and that's to help bring the Cold War to a peaceful end. And this was also one reason why he hated Soviet communism so much. It wasn't just the command economy, it wasn't just the totalitarian dictatorship, it was its atheism. And his faith is so important to him, and he's so enamored and focused on the Christian and Jewish dissidents behind the Iron Curtain. He just thought it was truly wicked that any government would persecute religious believers just for the peaceful expression of their faith, and would enforce atheism. And so that was what he also saw as a real vulnerability of the Soviet Union is any place that so persecutes its religious believers and denies the existence of God, that also is not sustainable. And I think he was right about that much more than most expert opinion.
Yeah, I think Soviet repression of religion was one of the main drivers of American anti-communism,
Mm-hmm.
it's part of why I think you had some progressive leftist Jews become neocons, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because of the suppression of Jews in the Soviet Union,
Oh
and
yeah,
a lot of American anti-communism was driven not because of the economic or the political system, but because of the religious repression.
yeah, you're exactly right.
We've already got some questions. I want to invite people to go ahead and type in their questions now. I'm having to fight the urge to just completely monopolize the Q&A. I want to ask one more question, and then we'll go to the questions in the Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
We talked at the beginning about how Reagan was ridiculed by the left, but also often doubted by some on the right. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I've always been very intrigued by the degree to which, by the incidents in which Reagan actually had to defy his own staff and advisors.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, anecdotally, there were at least two major incidents where this happened. One um, was his speech at the Brandenburg Gate,
Mm-hmm.
where he had advisors who, again, anecdotally kept stripping out the call for the wall to come down, kept stripping it out of his
Yeah,
speeches, and he
yeah.
insisted on doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
I'd love for you to comment on that. And then the second incident, I think, is Reykjavik in Iceland,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
where, you know, reportedly, anecdotally, almost all of his advisors thought he was making a tremendous strategic mistake at Reykjavik in Iceland.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we've got a question here in a minute about SDI.
Mm-hmm.
But would you comment briefly on at least those two incidents, if not more, where Reagan actually his confidence and his moral clarity was such that he was willing to actually defy his own advisors?
Mhm. Yeah, and this goes back to how he was not just some, as the caricature, dim-witted Hollywood actor reading the cue cards that others were writing for him and putting it in front of him. I mean, he was much more, like I said, in command, resolved, had a clear strategic vision, especially on these big issues that mattered most. So, yeah, so with the Berlin Wall speech, Reagan had for years, he had the first time he had seen the Berlin Wall, I want to say was 1978. So he's a private citizen at the time, but he knows he's going to be running for president in the 1980 campaign, and so he's doing a world tour to meet with other leaders to kind of stay current on different foreign policy issues. And he visits West Berlin, and his tour guides take him over to show him the wall. He's even at one point in a building in West Berlin looking out over the wall and sees the Stasi, the East German police, detain a young East German man, probably for wearing the wrong clothes or something like that. And Reagan is just appalled at this wall. It just violates every, core of his convictions about a free society and the free movement of peoples. But also for him highlights again this illegitimacy of this system. If communism is such a workers' paradise, why do they have to build walls to imprison their own people, right? And so even then he made comments about, I'd love to see this wall go away someday, right? So this was a longstanding conviction of his. So fast forward 9 years later, when he's going to give his iconic address at the wall, and he and his wonderful young speechwriter Peter Robinson want to put in the phrase, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor and all the experts keep taking it out, saying, no, it's too provocative. It'll never happen. It'd be destabilizing. That wall's been there for almost 30 years at this point. It's never going to come down. But again, Reagan, he knew that one of his main audiences for his speeches were the peoples of East Germany, right? The ones imprisoned by the wall. And he wanted to speak to them, and he wanted to, be a voice for the voiceless, right? Because they didn't have a platform, they didn't have a free press or any means of sharing their views. But he also, as important as the phrase "tear down this wall" is the two words that come before it: Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Now, wait a minute. Why, if the wall is in East Germany, why are you addressing your message to some guy in Moscow? It goes back to, he wanted to highlight it's the Soviet Union that put this wall up as an act of imperialism, violating, dividing this country, violating the self-determination and rights of the East and West German people. And so he wanted, it was his way of kind of taking the offensive, again, the ideological offensive in the Cold War. Of course, it drove Gorbachev crazy that he said this. It is a real humiliation for Gorbachev. And yet, ultimately, Reagan's vision does prevail. It's not Gorbachev himself who tears down the wall, but Gorbachev doesn't lift a finger when the peoples of East and West Berlin tear down the wall. Previous Soviet leaders like Brezhnev would have sent in the tanks to crush him, right? And there's good evidence that Reagan's words at least helped to embolden and inspire the people of Berlin to know, hey, we do have a champion in the West. Then the Reykjavik summit. This is October of 1986, when Reagan, it's the second time Reagan and Gorbachev meet there. And Reagan goes much further than his advisors were willing or interested in doing, and telling Gorbachev, hey, let's abolish all nuclear weapons, right? Let's not just kind of pare them back or cap the further growth. Let's abolish all of them. These things are insane. They could destroy the whole world. That's totally contrary to God's design for the world. And Gorbachev is willing to go along with him, except for Gorbachev is still obsessed with SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. This was Reagan's vision of using America's technological might and edge to build a multi-layered ballistic missile shield. And Reagan, had very and Gorbachev would say, well, if we're going to abolish all nukes, you don't need SDI. And Reagan would say, yeah, but what if the technology is still out there? What if a crazy dictator like Gaddafi in Libya, or the Iranian mullahs, what if they get a nuke? It's a good concern. And Reagan also would appeal to lessons of history, tell Gorbachev, look, after we banned poison gas after World War I, we didn't get rid of our gas masks either, right? So Reagan had some very common sense ways of pointing out that this SDI could still be a helpful part of a defensive arsenal. But Gorbachev was so terrified of SDI, thought that it would take away the Soviet Union's, as it would, strategic edge in their longer range ballistic missiles, that Gorbachev wouldn't cut a deal unless Reagan would give up SDI. At the time, the summit was seen as a horrible failure. There's some iconic photos of Reagan and Gorbachev leaving the house in Reykjavik where they'd been meeting, both of them looking very angry and despondent. And yet we now know that Reagan's resolve at Reykjavik, and holding fast to SDI, kept that pressure on Gorbachev. Remember, it goes back to what I was saying, even though Reagan is negotiating with Gorbachev and willing to make some concessions, he's not going to ease up the pressure. He doesn't ease up the pressure. And that SDI kept the pressure on. And that's why Gorbachev, a few months later, came back to the negotiating table and said, all right, we'll get rid of all the intermediate range nuclear missiles. You Americans win, which is a huge victory on Reagan's part.
Okay, so you got a hard out at the top of the hour, so let's try to get to
Yeah,
as many of these questions as possible. And
sure.
you've anticipated the first question. Our friend Professor Daniel Ogden from Baylor asks, "How important do you believe SDI was in winning the Cold War?" And so you see that as the ultimate leverage at Reykjavik, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And just yeah, a couple extra points to bring on that. Going back to what I mentioned earlier in our discussion about Reagan's military buildup was not just about outbuilding, but also outsmarting the Soviets. When Reagan would look at where the Soviet military advantages were, one that he saw was the Soviets had about twice as many large, long-range nuclear missiles as the United States did. I'm maybe getting some of the numbers off, but they had a much more capable arsenal there. And Reagan thought, well, rather than us trying to match the Soviets missile for missile, let's see if we can use American technology to make those missiles obsolete, where that if they're launched, they can't get through. So that's his strategic innovation. Now, a lot of critics at the time and even now said, well, SDI will never work. That's why Teddy Kennedy disparaged it as, a Star Wars, this fantasy, the science fiction fantasy thing. Um, but 2 points on that. One, if you look at Israel's Iron Dome or David's Sling or the American, Patriot missiles and our anti-missile systems today, a lot of them do draw on Reagan's SDI technology, right? It's not all one for one, but he was ahead of his time in envisioning it. He knew it might take decades for it to work. Um, but the second is Reagan's strategic vision. He knew that when he's negotiating with Gorbachev, it doesn't so much matter if this SDI will work right now or not. It matters that Gorbachev thinks it'll work, right? And it was in that sense, it might have been an ultimate bluff. Gorbachev was totally bamboozled by American technology. That those Americans, they can invent anything, right? And we now know from declassified Soviet documents that Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership were just terrified of SDI. And so Reagan thought, all right, Reagan himself, may or may not have thought it would actually work, but he thought that doesn't matter. As long as they think it'll work, then I'm going to keep pressing our advantage here.
Well, I like to think that we actually do have some SDI up there somewhere that we don't know about, but um, our friend Joe Nussbaum alludes to a conversation that we had about how the diplomatic elite treated Reagan like he was simple and stupid. And Joe wants to know, has the diplomatic elite changed at all, or would they have the same attitude toward another leader with moral clarity and confidence?
Oh, it's probably the latter. I'm afraid. Yeah, having worked at the State Department in the George W. Bush administration, I've seen that. Yeah, a lot of the career diplomats, unfortunately, do have some of that disparagement.
Yeah.
Although one thing I will say is another very important character in the book besides Reagan himself, who's central, is George Shultz, as Secretary of State. And Schultz, I think, is a really underappreciated Secretary of State. He was a vital partner, kind of sidekick, alter ego for Reagan. Schultz knew that Reagan would set the strategic vision, but it's up to Schultz to do a lot of the diplomacy to carry it out. And Schultz was much beloved by a lot of the career diplomats who just recognized how capable he was. And Schultz pointed out to a lot of them, look, this president that you're serving under is a lot sharper and has a lot more strategic vision and moral clarity than you've given him credit for. And so Schultz helped bring around some of the Reagan skeptics at the State Department, as well as just reminding them who they worked for. One quick anecdote I got to share that I like about Schultz is so anytime a new American ambassador was going to get ready to get sent out to the embassy, the country that he's going to be representing, whether it's West Germany or Japan or Australia or France or China. Schultz would bring the American ambassador into his office, kind of do a departure photo with him, wish him well, give him some final guidance. And then Schultz would say, one more thing, there's that globe over in the corner. Go over to that globe and point out to me your country. Okay. And the ambassador would go over, inevitably kind of spin the globe and point to whatever country they're about to get posted to. Oh, my country here. And Schultz would say, wrong. Your country is the United States, and don't ever forget it.
That's great. That's
Yeah,
terrific.
and so that's what I mean about Schultz helped communicate Reagan's moral clarity to
Yeah.
the professional diplomats.
Okay, so let's spend the rest of our time. Let's use another question by Dan Ogden from Baylor, because I do want to touch on this idea of how you speculate that Reagan would approach some of the foreign policy challenges we have right now. Dan asks, how would Reagan view the great power competition today between the U.S. and China? And I'd also like to get your thoughts on how you think Reagan might approach the current conflict in the Middle East with Israel and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'll share a few thoughts on those, and I have in other settings as well. But I always have to put the disclaimer up front. Um, I don't know, and no one knows for sure. Okay,
Yeah.
I can tell you what Reagan did in the 1980s because I wrote a book on it. But anything I say about how he might handle things today is going to be somewhat speculative. But I'll take the opportunity to speculate some. Um, on China, I do think Reagan would start thinking about the China problem with a similar framework he did with the Soviet Union, which is that this is fundamentally a contest of ideas between, the free market and democratic system of the United States and this kind of authoritarian, totalitarian quasi-capitalism in China, right? And so Reagan would see the core of the problem in China is the Chinese Communist Party itself. So it's not that China's powerful; it is that it's ruled by this personality cult and this dictator Xi Jinping. So I think he would start with that. He would be very concerned about our eroding military balance with China. I've said in other settings, the Chinese Communist Party has actually taken a page out of Reagan's playbook in that they've been trying to design new weapon systems to outsmart American ones, and that's a whole other session we could have.
Yeah.
Reagan would be very concerned about the eroding military balance between the United States and China, and he would, put more resources in the Pentagon, but also make sure that these are being used for innovation in the next generation of weapon systems, whether it's unmanned or artificial intelligence and all those things, to leverage the best of American technology. Reagan would also, I think, be very focused on human rights and religious freedom in China. The current administration has really neglected this. The previous administration did a little more on it, but not enough. Reagan would know that the fact that China spends billions of dollars each year on the most extensive, pervasive surveillance system the world has ever seen to control what its own people can think and say and read on the internet or put on social media, he would see that as a vulnerability, just as he saw the Soviet repression as a vulnerability, and so he'd do more to support human rights there. But he'd also be open to diplomacy, right? Because he would not want the new Cold War between us and China to turn into a hot war. And Tom, besides China, what was the other one about what would Reagan do to?
Israel and the Middle East.
Oh yeah, yeah. Reagan was a very strong supporter of Israel. You have to start with that fundamentally. He was at that point the strongest, gave the strongest support to Israel of any American president before he really took it to a new level. He concluded the first ever free trade agreement with Israel in the United States. He signed an official defense partnership between us. So he's very supportive of Israel. So again, you'd have to start with that. But Reagan. While my book is overall very favorable treatment of his foreign policy, if you do get a chance to read it, you'll see I'm fairly critical of his Middle East policy. He never had a real strategic vision for the region. I share his support for Israel. I'm not critical on that. But he could never figure out how that fit into a broader strategy for the region. And of course, he inherited some real difficult challenges there. And if you look at two of his biggest foreign policy failures in the Middle East, the first is when the 241 Marine peacekeepers are killed by the terrorist bombing in Beirut in 1983.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, the Iran-Contra scandal when he was, selling arms to Iran to try to get hostages released.
The Beirut incident seemed to really scar him. I mean, when that
Yeah.
happened, I mean, it's almost like he withdrew from the Middle East almost. I mean, that's probably an
Yeah.
overstatement, but
Yeah, he was rightly traumatized by it, and as any good president would have been.
yeah. Why don't we wrap up with okay, I got a couple. Here's a couple quickies. This is the
Okay.
lightning round. Okay.
Okay.
Jeff Mayer, was Reagan robbed of a Nobel Peace Prize? Why didn't Reagan get a Nobel Peace Prize?
Yes, he was. It's a huge shame that he wasn't given one. He absolutely should have gotten one. So,
Okay. Next question. Again, lightning round. Have you seen Kirby Wilbur, friend here in Dallas, longtime conservative radio talk show host, asks, have you seen the recent Reagan movie?
I haven't yet. I need to. It's on my list, but afraid I haven't. I've heard good things about it.
Yeah, I haven't. I haven't yet, but that's my goal for this weekend. Um, okay, so now I'm going to ask you this question. Back to China, because until Xi, I think until recently, this on the center right, at least, the attitude was that economic liberty would eventually usher in individual liberty and political liberty, right? That economic liberalization would eventually usher in political liberalization.
Mm-hmm.
The thought pendulum right now has swung 180 degrees in the opposite direction. The thought
Mm-hmm.
right now is, boy, was that stupid. Boy, was that naive. China's our enemy. I like to think that that story hasn't played all the way out yet. I like to think that it's still possible at the end of the day that economic liberalization still does contribute toward political liberalization. And I kind of think Reagan would have the same idea.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just interested in your thoughts on whether a Reagan approach to China, it would no doubt involve negotiation through strength, right? It would no
Mm-hmm.
doubt
Yeah.
involve a military buildup. It would no doubt involve moral clarity, calling out the system, the human rights abuses, the religious persecution. It would no doubt involve all of those things. But would it not also involve what you described as Reagan's attitude toward Gorbachev, which was constructive engagement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, very good question. Again, with the caveat that I, can't say exactly what his China policy would be today. I can say what his China policy was in the 1980s. Now, China was a kind of a semi-partner of ours in the 1980s because they were helping us to counter the Soviets. And this goes back to, Reagan did appreciate Nixon's initial opening there to China. But when Reagan visited China in 1984, he gave a number of speeches applauding China's early economic reforms and encouraging them to say, keep doing this, and then embrace democracy and human rights and religious freedom too. And he does it very eloquently. So he was a great champion of that holistic sense of freedom. And it is an empirical fact that in a lot of other countries, economic liberalization did lead to political freedom. That was the case with Taiwan, with South Korea, with Chile, with them transitioning from military dictatorships to pluralistic democracies. It started with a rising middle class and economic growth. And there's a longer discussion I have on China, but 15, 20 years ago, China was reforming a little bit politically, as they were certainly reforming more economically. And then, one of the many tragedies of Xi Jinping is he reversed that, right? He decided that the top priority overall is to preserve the Chinese Communist Party's monopoly on power. So he also has reversed some of their economic reforms, right? The Chinese economy is not near as open now as it was, 10, 15 years ago. It never was completely open. I want to be very careful about not going that far. So in a way, they're almost the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah, although, I think I live in hope partially that something similar will happen in China, which is that another leader will come along, right? I mean, when you were
Yeah.
describing Reagan and the Soviet Union, a couple of leaders had to die and move off the scene before one came along that was actually open to reform. So
Yeah.
in China, so much of the system does seem to be determined from the top down that if you had a change at the top, maybe you get another Deng Xiaoping or something like that.
Yeah,
We'll
maybe so.
we'll have to call upon you again in the future to come and do a broader foreign policy Zoom, if that would be okay. But
Would be happy to. Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for writing the book. Again, I want to encourage our audience, go out, get the book. It's terrific. I'm looking forward to finishing it again, hopefully this weekend. We really appreciate you all joining us. Again, don't forget that this will be archived. This video will be archived on our website and on our YouTube channel. And once again, Dr. Inboden, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for the good work you're doing at the University of Florida.
Thank you very much, Tom. Really enjoyed it. Okay, take care.
Should our parents and grandparents on the Zoom here consider sending their children to University of Florida?
Oh, please do. I'm very excited about what we're building here. The Hamilton Center is a Western civilization. We're a new college, really offering a number of degrees in Western civilization. Rigorous education, but connected to American values, and then hopefully getting your kids good jobs. So
there you go.
Yeah, the only thing we don't have right now is a winning football team, but we'll try to change that soon
Well,
too.
these things come and go, right?
Yeah, that's and UT have a great year, and it's fun to see that. So
yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again. Thank you so much for joining us, and for all of you who have joined us, we appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
take care. Thanks, everyone. All right.